Before the dust settled in the condemned Creston South train station, one desperate mother thought she was just sweeping away history to pay her rent. She had no idea the rusted lockbox buried beneath the floorboards held a century-old secret, one that would either save her family or destroy it. The Creston South station had been abandoned since 1987, left to rot on the forgotten edge of town where the city planners refused to look. Over the decades, its grand Romanesque arches had surrendered to creeping ivy, and the magnificent stained glass skylights had been reduced to jagged, soot-stained teeth. It was a monument to a bygone era of prosperity, but to 34-year-old Evelyn Harper, it was nothing more than a lifeline. Evelyn's hands were blistered and wrapped in cheap electrical tape. Her lungs burned with the smell of mildew, pigeon droppings, and decades of undisturbed dust. She swung the heavy push broom across the concourse, the coarse bristles scraping against the cracked terrazzo floor. She had begged for this job. Gregory Mitchell, the city zoning manager, had initially laughed in her face when she marched into his office asking for the cleanup contract. The city was scheduled to demolish the station in exactly 14 days to make way for a concrete strip mall. Mitchell had budgeted $5,000 for a professional hazmat crew to do a cursory sweep before the wrecking balls arrived. Evelyn told him she would do it in 10 days for $2,000 in cash. Mitchell, a man whose greed always outweighed his bureaucratic duty, had smirked and handed her a master key and a stack of industrial trash bags. He didn't care about her safety or the structural integrity of the rotting roof above her head. He cared about the $3,000 he was about to pocket. Evelyn didn't care about the danger either. All she cared about was her 8-year-old son, Leo. Leo's asthma had worsened sharply over the humid Midwestern summer, leading to 2 terrifying hospitalizations. The medical bills had piled up on her kitchen counter, forming a towering, insurmountable mountain of white envelopes printed with bold red warnings. Her landlord, Mr. Gable, had taped a final eviction notice to her apartment door 3 days ago. If she didn't have $2,000 by the first of the month, she and Leo would be sleeping in her rusted 2006 Honda Civic. So she swept. She hauled endless bags of debris out to the dumpsters, shivering in the freezing November wind. She ignored the aching protests of her muscles and the sharp sting in her cracked knuckles. By the end of the 7th day, the main concourse was remarkably clear. The massive wooden benches, though scarred, were visible again. The ticket booths stood like empty confessionals in the dim, slanting afternoon light. Evelyn leaned against the handle of her broom, wiping a streak of grimy sweat from her forehead. She was exhausted to her very marrow, but a fierce spark of pride flared in her chest. She was going to make it. She was going to save her boy. She moved toward the back of the station, aiming for the station master's office, a room Mitchell had specifically told her not to bother with because the roof had partially caved in. But Evelyn was thorough, and she didn't want to give Mitchell any excuse to withhold her payment. The door to the office was swollen shut, warped by decades of moisture. Evelyn wedged an iron crowbar into the frame and threw her entire body weight against it. With a violent crack, the rusted hinges gave way, and she stumbled forward into the gloom. The room smelled different from the rest of the station. Beneath the scent of decay, there was a faint, metallic tang, like old copper and dry earth. Plaster and rotting wood littered the center of the room where the ceiling had failed, burying a massive, solid oak desk. Evelyn began clearing the debris, tossing chunks of drywall and shattered glass out into the hallway. As she dragged a heavy piece of timber away from the desk, her work boot caught on something uneven. She stumbled, catching herself against the edge of the oak desk. Frowning, She looked down. The hardwood floorboards beneath the desk were warped, but one board was sitting at an unnatural angle. The nails had been pried up, their rusted heads completely sheared off. Curiosity overrode her exhaustion. Evelyn knelt on the cold floor, shining her heavy-duty flashlight onto the anomaly. She wedged her fingers into the gap between the boards and pulled. It wouldn't budge. She grabbed her crowbar, sliding the flattened edge into the crack, and applied pressure. The wood groaned, splitting down the middle with a sharp snap. Beneath the board was a dark, rectangular hollow, cut perfectly into the foundational joists. And sitting inside the cavity, wrapped in an oilcloth that had turned stiff and brittle with time, was a heavy iron lockbox. Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. She reached into the hole. The box was incredibly heavy, weighing at least 20 pounds. She had to use both hands, straining her shoulders as she hauled it up and onto the dusty floor. It was roughly the size of a large shoebox, constructed of thick, blackened iron, with a heavy brass padlock securing the front latch. For a long moment, she just stared at it. In her mind, she heard Mitchell's greasy voice telling her that anything found on city property belonged to the city. If she handed this over to him, he would undoubtedly claim whatever was inside for himself and still demand she finish the cleanup for her measly $2,000. Evelyn thought of Leo, struggling to breathe in his sleep, the sound of his wheezing echoing in their small, drafty apartment. She thought of the eviction notice. She didn't hesitate. Evelyn shoved the heavy box into her largest canvas duffel bag, buried it beneath her dirty work gloves and a pile of rags, and hoisted it over her shoulder. She locked the station doors behind her, the heavy deadbolt sliding into place with a definitive click. She was taking it home. Evelyn didn't open the box right away. She waited until she had picked Leo up from her neighbor's apartment, fed him a cheap dinner of macaroni and hot dogs, and tucked him into bed. Only when the apartment was completely silent, save for the rhythmic hiss of the radiator, did she bring the heavy canvas bag into the cramped kitchen. She set the iron box on the formica table. Under the harsh glare of the overhead bulb, it looked even more ancient and deeply intimidating. The brass padlock was thick, but the years in the damp station had corroded the inner mechanism. She took a heavy hammer and a flathead screwdriver from her meager toolbox. Wedging the screwdriver into the shackle of the lock, she brought the hammer down with a muffled thud, wrapping a dish towel around the tools to dampen the noise. It took 5 agonizing, sweaty minutes of brutal force before the rusted inner pins shattered. The padlock popped open, falling to the floor with a heavy clatter. Evelyn's hands were shaking violently as she flipped the iron latch up and opened the lid. She didn't know what she had expected. Gold coins, stacks of cash, diamonds. Instead, a profound sense of disappointment washed over her. The box was filled with paper. She exhaled a shaky breath and began to carefully pull the items out. The first was a thick stack of letters, tied together with a fraying piece of twine. The paper was yellowed, the edges crumbling like dry leaves. She untied the string and opened the top letter. It was dated October 14th, 1932, written in elegant, looping cursive ink. It was signed by a man named Nathaniel Reed. Evelyn skimmed the words. It read like a frantic confession. "They are closing in, Josephine. The railroad men know what I have done. I have hidden the ledgers where they will never look, beneath the feet of 1,000 strangers. If anything happens to me, you must take the deed and go to Chicago. Do not trust the bank. Do not trust the law. Trust only the seal." Evelyn frowned, setting the letter aside. Beneath the letters was a heavy, silver pocket watch. It was tarnished completely black in places, but as she rubbed her thumb across the casing, she could see intricate engravings. The initials NR were etched into the front, surrounded by a strange, serpentine crest. She tried to open it, but the clasp was jammed shut. At the very bottom of the box was a thick, leather-bound folder. Evelyn opened it, her eyes scanning the heavy parchment inside. It was a property deed, covered in official-looking stamps and a thick red wax seal that remained perfectly intact despite the decades. The document granted full ownership of an entire commercial block in downtown Chicago to Nathaniel Reed and his descendants in perpetuity. Evelyn wasn't a lawyer, but even she knew that a commercial block in downtown Chicago was worth tens of millions of dollars today. Her mind raced. If this deed was legitimate, who owned that land now? Was Nathaniel Reed murdered? Was Josephine his wife? And more importantly, could she sell this historical artifact to a collector to pay her rent? The next morning, after dropping Leo off at school with his inhaler tucked safely into his backpack, Evelyn drove her sputtering Honda to the affluent side of Creston. She parked in front of a high-end antique shop named Finch & Co. Mid-Antiquities. She had wrapped the silver pocket watch in a soft cloth, leaving the deed and the letters locked in the trunk of her car. She needed to test the waters first. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. The shop smelled of beeswax polish and expensive cologne. Behind a glass display counter stood Desmond Finch, a tall, impossibly thin man in a tailored tweed suit. His pale eyes flicked over Evelyn's worn jeans and oversized sweater, immediately categorizing her as a nuisance. "May I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. "I have something I'd like to get appraised," Evelyn said, keeping her voice steady, despite the flutter in her stomach. She approached the counter and unwrapped the cloth, setting the tarnished silver pocket watch on the glass. Desmond barely glanced at it at first. "Madam, I deal in fine antiquities, not pawn shop trinkets. This is badly tarnished and likely a mass-produced piece from—" He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes had locked onto the serpentine crest surrounding the initials R. The change in his demeanor was terrifyingly instantaneous. The condescension vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory stillness. He didn't touch the watch. Instead, he leaned closer, his breathing suddenly shallow. "Where did you get this?" Desmond asked, his voice dropping an octave. Evelyn's survival instincts, honed by years of poverty and struggle, flared to life. "It belonged to my grandfather," she lied smoothly. "I found it in his attic." Desmond finally picked it up, slipping a jeweler's loop over his right eye. He turned the watch over in his long, pale fingers. He was trying to act nonchalant, but Evelyn noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. "It's a curious piece," Desmond said, carefully setting the watch back down. He didn't take off the loop. "The silver is of decent quality. I suppose I could offer you $500 for it." $500. It was a quarter of what she needed to save her apartment, but it was an astronomical sum for a broken watch. "I'll have to think about it," Evelyn said, reaching for the watch. Desmond's hand snapped out, his fingers hovering just an inch over hers, blocking her. "Wait," he said quickly. He forced a tight, artificial smile. 500 is an initial estimate. Actually, I am quite fond of this particular style. I will give you $2,000. Cash. Right now." Evelyn stared at him. A man like Desmond Finch didn't give away $2,000 out of charity. The watch was worth significantly more. or a chilling thought struck her. He knew exactly who Nathaniel Reed was. "Is there anything else that came with it?" Desmond asked, his pale eyes searching her face. "Papers? A box, perhaps? I am a collector of sets. If you have the original packaging or documents, I will write you a check for $5,000 this very second, sight unseen. $5,000. It would pay the rent, pay off the hospital bills, and keep her and Leo safe for months." But Evelyn remembered the desperate scrawl in Nathaniel Reed's letter. "Do not trust the bank. Do not trust the law. Trust only the seal." If Desmond Finch was willing to hand over $5,000 for a dusty box, what was it actually worth? "No," Evelyn said, her voice turning cold. She snatched the watch from the counter and shoved it deep into her coat pocket. "It's just the watch, and it's not for sale anymore." "Madam, please," Desmond said, dropping the polite facade entirely. His face hardened, the skin pulling taut over his cheekbones. "You do not understand what you are holding. Walk out that door, and you are putting yourself in a very dangerous position." "I'm already in a dangerous position," Evelyn shot back, backing away toward the door. "Have a nice day, Mr. Finch." She turned and bolted out of the shop, the bell chiming frantically behind her. She practically jogged to her car, her hands shaking so badly she dropped her keys twice before finally unlocking the door. She slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, her heart hammering in her throat. As she pulled away from the curb, she glanced in her rearview mirror. Desmond Finch was standing on the sidewalk outside his shop, watching her drive away. He was holding a cell phone to his ear. Evelyn drove for 20 minutes, taking a winding, erratic route through the suburbs to ensure she wasn't being followed. Only when she was certain she was alone did she pull into the cracked asphalt parking lot of her apartment complex. She killed the engine and rested her forehead against the steering wheel, trying to steady her breathing. She had been foolish. She should have taken the $5,000. She should have taken the money and run. But the deed to the Chicago block burned in her mind. It was a ticket to a life where Leo never had to suffer in a drafty apartment again. Evelyn grabbed her purse and stepped out of the car. As she walked toward the stairwell of her building, a sleek black sedan with heavily tinted windows pulled into the parking lot. It didn't park in a space. It rolled slowly down the aisle, the tires crunching against the gravel, and idled to a stop directly behind Evelyn's Honda Civic, boxing it in. Evelyn froze on the bottom step. The driver's side door of the sedan clicked open, and a man in a dark overcoat stepped out into the freezing November air. He didn't look at her car. He looked directly at Evelyn. "Mrs. Harper," the man called out, his voice smooth and heavily accented. "We need to talk about what you found in the Creston South Station." Evelyn's grip tightened on the worn strap of her purse. The man in the dark overcoat possessed a chilling, unnatural stillness. He didn't look like a common thug. His suit was tailored from expensive wool. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his posture screamed corporate authority. He introduced himself as Harrison Croft, a senior acquisitions director for Vanguard Holdings, a massive, multi-billion-dollar real estate conglomerate currently dominating the skyline of downtown Chicago. "I don't know what you're talking about," Evelyn lied, her voice surprisingly steady despite the violent hammering against her ribs. "I clean abandoned buildings for the city zoning manager. I don't find things. I just throw away trash." Croft smiled, a thin, razor-sharp gesture completely devoid of warmth. "Desmond Finch made a very interesting phone call 20 minutes ago, Mrs. Harper. We know you have Nathaniel Reed's lockbox. Vanguard Holdings currently owns the commercial block outlined in that ancient deed. Or rather, we claim to own it. Reed's missing property deed has been a massive thorn in our legal department's side for 70 years. Without the original document, our claim to the land is built on a very fragile foundation. He took a slow, calculated step closer, pulling a sleek leather checkbook from his breast pocket. Hand over the documents right now, and I will write you a cashier's check for $50,000. Refuse, and my company will bury you in litigation until you are homeless and destitute. And given your son Leo's rapidly deteriorating medical condition, I imagine you cannot afford a prolonged legal war. You need money for his hospital bills, Evelyn. I am offering you a way out." The casual mention of Leo sent a jolt of pure, white-hot fury through Evelyn's veins. Croft had investigated her in record time. He knew her exact vulnerabilities. "I don't have it," Evelyn repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as she backed up the concrete stairs toward the entrance of her building. "And if you ever come near my son, I will kill you." She didn't wait for his response. Evelyn bolted up the stairs, fumbling frantically with her keys, and slammed the heavy apartment door shut, instantly throwing the deadbolt. Her hands were shaking so violently, she could barely dial her neighbor's phone number to ensure Leo was safe. He was safely eating snacks and watching cartoons. Evelyn dragged the heavy canvas bag from beneath her bed, her mind racing with terrifying possibilities. She couldn't fight a billionaire conglomerate on her own, but she couldn't surrender either. Nathaniel Reed had specifically warned Josephine not to trust the law or the banks. Trust only the seal. She pulled out the heavy parchment deed. The thick red wax seal bore the same serpentine crest as the silver pocket watch. Holding it up to the harsh, flickering kitchen light, Evelyn noticed a faint, microscopic indentation pressed deeply into the wax, a secondary stamp she had missed before. It wasn't just a family crest, it was a professional logo, a Scales of Justice emblem with the letters PW delicately interwoven into the base. Evelyn sprinted to her battered laptop, typing frantically into the search engine. PW Scales of Justice, Chicago. 1930s real estate law. Pages of dusty historical archives flooded the glowing screen. Finally, a scanned article from the Chicago Tribune, dated 1934, appeared. It detailed a prominent, fiercely incorruptible law firm known as Pendleton and Wright. They were the only attorneys in the entire city who had stubbornly refused to be bought out by the corrupt railroad barons of the era. According to the business directory, the firm still existed today. Having evolved over the decades, they were now operating under the name Wright, Montgomery, and Hayes. She found their modern corporate contact page. They were a powerhouse litigation firm located in a massive glass tower on LaSalle Street. Evelyn didn't hesitate for a single second. She packed the lockbox back into the canvas bag, grabbed a heavy kitchen knife for protection, and snuck out the rusted fire escape window, abandoning her blocked-in Honda Civic entirely. She sprinted through the freezing alleyways, hopped a chain-link fence, and boarded a 2-hour commuter bus heading straight into the heart of downtown Chicago, her heart pounding with every bump in the road. The towering glass and steel skyscraper looming over LaSalle Street was a far cry from the rotting, pigeon-infested Creston South Station. Evelyn, clutching her dirty canvas bag, ignored the intensely judgmental stares of the corporate receptionists and loudly demanded to see a senior partner. When the security guards approached to escort her out, she refused to leave, screaming that she had the missing Nathaniel Reed deed and threatening to call every local news station in the city. The commotion worked. Eventually, she was ushered into the sprawling, luxurious corner office of Benjamin Hayes, a senior partner in his late 60s with distinguished silver hair and sharp, incredibly intelligent eyes. He listened patiently as Evelyn, exhausted, dirty, and desperate, spilled the entire, unbelievable story. She placed the heavy iron lockbox, the tarnished pocket watch, and the ancient deed directly onto his polished mahogany desk. Hayes leaned forward, meticulously inspecting the red wax seal with a jeweler's magnifying glass. When he finally looked up, all the color had drained from his face. "My grandfather was Jonathan Wright," Hayes whispered, his voice thick with sudden emotion. "He personally represented Nathaniel Reed. Reed was brutally murdered in an alleyway before he could securely transfer this deed to his wife, Josephine. Vanguard Holdings fabricated a fraudulent bill of sale in 1935 to steal the land and build their empire. Our firm always suspected massive fraud, but the original deed was lost to history. This," he gently touched the brittle parchment, "this proves Vanguard built a billion-dollar corporate empire on stolen land." "They offered me $50,000, Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly. "A man named Harrison Croft ambushed me. He threatened my son." A fierce, righteous anger ignited in Hayes's eyes. "Mrs. Harper, Vanguard Holdings is about to lose a very significant portion of their empire today. By strict legal definition, and the finder of this abandoned, stolen property, and with the Reed bloodline completely extinguished decades ago, you are fully entitled to a percentage of the recovered estate under the state's salvage and recovery statutes." "How much money are we talking about?" Evelyn asked, holding her breath. "Enough to buy Vanguard's entire building and fire Harrison Croft yourself," Hayes replied grimly. The ensuing legal battle was swift, ruthless, and brutal, but it was fought entirely behind closed boardroom doors. Once Hayes officially presented Vanguard's terrified attorneys with the authenticated deed and the looming threat of a massive, extremely public historical fraud scandal, the mighty conglomerate completely capitulated. They simply couldn't afford the catastrophic public relations nightmare or the federal criminal investigation it would inevitably trigger. 2 weeks later, Evelyn sat in Hayes's plush office as a massive settlement agreement was quietly pushed across the desk. It was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement in exchange for relinquishing the physical deed to the city archives. Sitting directly across from her was Harrison Croft, his previous arrogance entirely replaced by pale, sweaty defeat. Evelyn stared at the certified cashier's check firmly attached to the legal document. $7.5 million. Tears spilled down her cheeks, washing away weeks of grime, terrifying fear, and bone-deep exhaustion. She thought of the cruel eviction notice, the towering stack of hospital bills, and the choking dust of the abandoned train station. All of it was finally over. 6 months later, Evelyn Harper walked out of the premier pediatric respiratory clinic in downtown Chicago, holding a perfectly healthy, smiling Leo tightly by the hand. They climbed into a pristine, new SUV, leaving the dark memory of the freezing, mold-ridden apartment far behind them forever. She had purchased a beautiful, sprawling home in the quiet suburbs and immediately set up a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation specifically designed to help single mothers facing sudden eviction. As they drove away toward their new life, Evelyn gently touched the silver pocket watch she had kept for herself, feeling the intricate serpentine crest beneath her thumb. She had originally thought she was just sweeping away forgotten history to pay her monthly rent. But hidden in the cold ashes of the past, she had miraculously unearthed her family's bright, unshakable future. What would you do if you found a secret that could change your life forever? Evelyn's journey proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places everyone else has abandoned. If this incredible story of resilience, mystery, and a mother's fierce love kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories.